hoping some other people will come. So my name is Valery Borde. I'm a freelance science journalist in Quebec City, Canada. And I'm mainly working for a general interest magazine named L'Actualité. First, I'd like to thank our host here in Korea for this wonderful conference, and I'd like to thank also our three speakers today for accepting my invitation to this session on climate change. So I present you first, maybe our first speaker. You'll see we have a kind of special organization for a session. So one of the speakers is Leigh Deyton. She's here. Leigh is from Australia. She's a freelance science writer and broadcaster and PhD candidate also at Macquarie University. And she's also a regular contributor to ABC Radio. Then we have, just close to her, Dominique Leglou, who is from France. And she's the editor-in-chief for the scientific magazine Science et Avenir, that means Science and Future, since 2003. And before she had worked for TV and for a newspaper. And then here joining us soon, we have Andrew Revkin from New York, which is not only a musician, the musician you heard yesterday, but also a blogger, an environmental blogger at the New York Times and a senior fellow for environmental understanding at Pace University. So we have three journalists from three parts of the world and three kinds of media. And so we have kind of debate like a mini UN summit on climate change. So let's talk a little bit about climate change now. As you probably all know, at the end of this year in December, there will be a very important conference in Paris. That will be the 21st conference of the parties of the UN Convention on Climate Change. The official objective of this conference is to achieve a universal and legally binding agreement between all countries that would allow to limit the increase of global temperatures below 2 degrees. As we hear in Seoul, negotiators are in Bonn, Germany, to discuss the 86 draft document that could be signed in Paris in about 6 months. But still at the moment there's a lot of job to do because main questions hasn't been solved. There are three main questions. First, how to classify countries and give them roles to fight climate change depending on the development level. The second important question is about the financing of the $100 billion funds that has been promised in Copenhagen from developed countries to developing countries to help them. At the moment there are less than $10 billion in this fund, so there's still a lot of job to do. And last but not least, each country had to submit its own national targets to reduce CO2 emissions. And at the moment only about 40 countries did so. They submitted their INDCs in the UN language. So about 25,000 people are supposed to attend the Paris conference, and lots of them probably will be science journalists, so a part of them. So today our speakers will help you to get prepared for this event. So we divided the session in three parts. First, each speaker will speak of the agreement, what they think that could happen in Paris. Then, in the second part, we will discuss about the role and limits of science journalists covering these negotiations that are far more to do with politics and diplomacy than with science. And last but not least, we will try to know how to gain the interest of the audience on this negotiation and more generally about climate change, as many people simply don't want to hear anything about these negotiations that they found useless and boring. So we'll have each, our speaker will speak about 5 minutes about each subject, and we'll turn the role of all of them, and then after that 45 minutes of presentation, we have question and answers. So for the first time, the first speaker about what will happen in Paris is Dominique, because she's in Paris, so maybe she has some cues for Dominique, your turn.
Well, the real genuine answer would be, I don't know. I don't know. that would be the truth. The only thing I know is that, as you mentioned in the end, it's become such a political issue in France that the president himself is pushing forcefully to get an agreement. Not only him, but also the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Fabius, F-A-B-I-U-S, who's better known these days to try to solve, and of course it's not solve problems on Syria, for example, but he decided to take the lead, which is not that simple for him, since in that government you have a very forceful woman who happened to be former Hollande's wife, former president's wife, Mrs. Royal, R-O-Y-A-L, Ségolène. Well, you know, women we call them by their first name and men by their last name. So you have a sort of competition in the government to be the one to show that he or she works to make sure that there will be an agreement. To remind you things about the political scene in France, you have to think that this president, Hollande, was not particularly green. He's from the Socialist Party, and our party was always confronted, our French Socialist Party was always confronted to a serious question, which is the nuclear question. And yesterday I had a session on nuclear matters, and if you were there, you understand it's never easy. And so I would just remind you one or two things. Which year in France do you think the most numerous, sorry for my bad English, most numerous nuclear power plants were built? Everyone has a guess. Maybe on this, do you have a guess?
The most numerous.
Yeah, well, when the year?
1976, maybe?
Wrong.
19.
Wrong. 1981. The year President Mitterrand was elected. The year that this president, this socialist president, was elected. Why do I tell you that? It's because, but now we could reconstruct the history. It's because there was a deal before the elections. There was a promise, for example, that a certain nuclear power plant would not be built. It was one in Brittany, where there was a big fight. Its name was Plogoff, P-L-O-G-O-F-F. And forceful Brittany women were in front of younger guys and said, "Are you going to beat me?" So this plant never was erected. And so the deal was, I won't build this plant if I'm elected. That's what was said by the to-be president to the guys of the nuclear scene. And I let you go on with all the plans, which were built afterwards, but elsewhere on the territory. So, you know, there was always a match between all governments and nuclear power. And now, as you may see, and when you arrived here in Seoul, first lecture was about nuclear power. It has a real deep political meaning. You know, we're not far from China, and China wants to build, and we don't know when exactly, more than 60 nuclear power plants. So I can't help thinking that our president, who was not particularly green, sees in this agreement, well, you know how it is. If it's successful, it will help him, sorry, not me, in the next election, which is within 2 years. And there's a deal also with the nuclear establishment. Because now, their first claim is that when you build nuclear plants, you avoid a lot of gas, a lot of
Carbon dioxide.
carbon dioxide, how do you call it? If it's greenhouse gases. Sorry, I was in this meal. I'm getting confused.
Too much phlegm?
Too much phlegm, yes. I said I would say a joke. I realized my own climate change, my internal climate change, I realized must have been totally changed by the fact that my tonsils were removed in the 50s, which was obviously a bad thing. So, frankly, I don't know if there will be an agreement. What we see, I'm not going to tell you what you already know. We see that the US says, well, we're going to do less coal. China, as a matter of fact, what we see is that economically speaking, it's decreasing. So maybe it won't be very difficult for China to create less greenhouse gases, because as soon as you decrease, then there's a sort of direct relationship. But the thing I could bring to you, being in France, is I'm amazed by the fact that now COP21 is everywhere. I mean, you go to any conference, well, you have to say something about COP21. Frankly, five years ago, even if it was always in the background, you had Sarkozy, previous president, saying, well, I don't know how to translate it in French, it's ça commence à bien faire. It means, well, we all get bored with that thing, so how can we get rid of it? That's the meaning of it. So, we had that president before. So you see, there's a change. It's not only climate, it'll be a little change. After that, they do what they can do. I think, at least in the country, it's everywhere, but you never know with those negotiations. I could, and I stop there, I'm talking too long. I just want to say that there was a very interesting trial, a test, I don't know how to call it, in fact it was theater, which was done by a sociologist you might have heard of. His name is Bruno Latour, L-A-T-O-U-R. And this sociologist, he asked 200 students to mimic the negotiations during 3 days. So they had been trained in advance. They'd been trained, and so they had their own role. And they added new roles, like I'm the representative of the forests, or I'm the representative of the oceans. You know, things which do not exist in the real negotiation, because they say those UN negotiations, the way they are held at the present time, is not the good format anymore. It has to be done in another way. And so they played these roles, and it was very funny because there were reports in the French press about that, and you know, people really taking their role very seriously. And you know, when they go out of the rooms, they start, well, you know what Korea did, and you know what Singapore said, and you know that. And I don't know, in fact, I'm not sure I know the results of these theatrical negotiations.
Well, thank you, Dominique, for this first intervention. So now we hear the Australian way of thinking about these negotiations.
Yeah, and to follow on your line of, I don't really know what's going to happen. What I can say is whatever it is, if the Australians have their way, it's not going to be very good. And here's the reason I say that. Just to give you a bit of context, I'd like to mention just 3 quotes. And the first one, plug your ears if you have sensitivities to language. It comes from our current Prime Minister, a man named Tony Abbott. And he said that climate change is absolute crap. That's the Prime Minister of Australia. That's his view about climate change. He's talking about climate change science. Just recently, he added to his repertoire of climate change knowledge by saying that coal is good for humanity. Nice man, huh? And then the third quote, just to give you a sense, comes from last week's Africa Progress Panel's 2015 report. And what they say is Australia is a free rider that has dropped off the list of credible nations taking action to curb greenhouse gas emissions. So the context from an Australian perspective is we don't expect much. We expect our government to go out of the way to be as difficult and uncooperative. They'll go around saying, oh yes, we believe in climate science and we are doing our very best, but they're not. It's a lot of baloney. Now, the reason Australia is so far behind on the picture goes back to its colonial days. It was a British outpost, and what it did was it provided resources, all the mining resources, agricultural resources, and the country never got off this wagon. They haven't had any reason to get smart, so right at the moment, they're definitely not. And right now, the resources industry is the dominant industry in Australia. The 2 largest taxpayers in the country are BHP Billiton and Rio Tinto. And BHP Billiton is known for coal, petroleum, copper, and iron ore. Rio Tinto is coal, uranium, iron ore, diamonds, bauxite, and aluminum. They're the largest taxpayers. So you know, he who pays the piper calls the tune. And so that they have been influencing the Conservative government, which is a government of people that believe in the free market ideologically without any evidence. These people are completely evidence-free in any form of social policy. So that's been a real problem. Australia is also the world's largest exporter of coal, 4th largest producer of coal behind China, USA, and India. About 55% of our coal is exported. So obviously, Australia likes coal. The government supports the coal industry. And to give you a flavor, at the last climate change conference, we had a different government. They went out and they said, climate change is the most important issue of our generation. This government does not. Let me just give you an example. When the government was elected in 2012, the things that they have done to impact the environment. They repealed a functioning emissions trading scheme. We were the first country in the world to get rid of an emissions trading scheme. They forgot to appoint a science minister until about a year into their regime, I guess I'll call it. And right before the Christmas holidays on a Friday afternoon, they announced that the industry minister would also take care of science. So there's not a lot of interest at the official level. They decommissioned the Independent Climate Commission, and this provided information to the public, to the general evidence-based, this is the latest evidence that the scientific community is telling us. This is what's going on around the world. One of the first things government did was they got rid of that. It's attempting to get rid of a legislatively mandated climate change authority, and this is a body that advised government. They don't even want to hear about it. What are some of the other things that they've done? They've hobbled an organization called the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. This was a body that was set up by the previous government, which was a more progressive government. And what it does is it had $10 billion, and it was to fund renewable energy startup profits. And this government that says that everything has to make a buck is getting rid of it, and the finance corporation was making money. So it's purely ideological. They've established a so-called direct action plan to reduce carbon emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. And how does this work? Well, they just pay emitters to say, oh, we're not going to emit anymore. Well, we'll reduce our amount. So they're paying the people that are releasing the emissions instead of taxing them for their emissions. And they're attempting to lower the renewable energy targets for the country. There's a big bun fight about that going on right at the moment. So Australia is not presenting a particularly promising face at this point. There was a recent, do you know the Climate Action Tracker group? They're a great website. I don't know, are you going to be mentioning them? What they do is they keep track of what all countries are doing regarding their emissions. And it is noted that Australia's pledged to reduce its emissions by 5% below 2000 base levels by 2020 under Copenhagen. And they have rated these targets as completely inadequate. They also point out that the new legislation that's coming in is likely to increase emissions by 12 to 18% above 2000 levels, rather than a 5% reduction. This is not a good look. At the Borde meeting, Australia was the country that was asked the most questions by other partners, about 39 questions. People saying, what do you mean? You're going to do this and you're going to do that, and the next best thing, and they had to answer all this stuff. And they kind of went, ugh. And as right before I left, I rang up the environment minister's office and said, well, what are you planning on pledging? And they said, we haven't announced that yet. They haven't announced it, they haven't figured it out. They don't even know who's going to be attending COP21. It will probably be the foreign affairs minister. Not a good look. This is seriously not a good look. So, in other words, if you ask what do Australians expect out of COP21, it's not an awful lot. And we're going to be the nasty bad boy players. And I'm extremely embarrassed. And I wish I knew where I could move to. Live in a country that has a better. Don't look at Canada. No, they're a similar problem.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Valery, for organizing this panel. Thanks to everyone for being here. Actually, if you could, the sound guy in the back, if you could switch over, we might be able to show some things later. This is my blog. This was a piece I did after Lima, where essentially I say soft is the new hard. It used to be hard targets and timetables. That's what everyone demanded from this treaty process. Way back in 1992, when this process began, it was aspirational, and that was seen increasingly as insufficient. But now we've gone back to essentially what will be ultimately always an aspirational process. There will be an agreement in Paris, absolutely. And there will be people who will say it's a failure because it's too weak. And there'll be people who will say, well, there'll be people who don't want anything.
You mean Australia.
But in covering this now since the 1980s, since before there was a framework convention, since before there was an IPCC, I've developed an understanding for the arc of this issue. I think that old timers tend to get, which is that this is a very long haul. The fundamental mistakes were made in framing the treaty process in in the run-up to Copenhagen. Ban Ki-moon kept using the words "seal the deal" as if there was some magical moment. There was an expectation of President Obama in office in 2008. He finally had everything aligned to get a binding treaty with hard targets and firm financial commitments for poor countries and all that stuff. And that all fell apart at Copenhagen, and it fell apart because essentially the world is too variegated to ever expect some kind of magical top-down process to solve this problem. And some people will say that a shift back to soft diplomacy, which was a term that Nobel Prize-winning economist Tom Schelling used in framing what we should do way back in Rio in 1992, is the only way to get a universal agreement. You will not have India signing anything that smacks of signing a contract. It will not happen. I just talked recently with some top Indian officials and former officials, and someone will say, "Oh God, how dare India do this?" But as you may have heard from some of the Indian journalists here, India is so utterly under-energized that there's no way for the hyper-energized world to point a finger legitimately in India and say you have an obligation to not double your coal use between now and 2025, which is what India has already said it's going to do, even as it ramps up solar and renewables. Because I'll just give you one little piece of math that I try to keep in my mind always in looking at these arguments for action from developing countries. The most recent carbon tracker numbers for India, for per capita emissions of carbon dioxide per year, like how many tons of CO2 is each person responsible for, it's still under 2. So it's about 1.9 tons per person per year in India. The United States has done this magical thing of moving from 20 down to 17, which is great. That's pretty great progress. But for John Kerry, as he did a year ago, to go to Indonesia, another country, give a speech, sort of a finger-pointing speech saying, you've got to get on board with emissions reductions because you have a lot of coal. By the way, I'm an opinion writer now, that's why I can say things like I'm saying. It's just so not just hypocritical, it's just stupid. I wrote a piece at the time. I didn't use the word stupid, but I just couldn't understand any diplomatic logic in the United States going to Indonesia and saying you shouldn't burn your coal. So when you look at that landscape, the only way you're going to get an agreement, and you will, because it's so important for Europe particularly to host a conference and have it not come to an agreement, Europe will have to give up the idea that it will have hard targets and timetables. It will be the old kind of concrete agreement, the Kyoto-style thing, which of course never worked ultimately anyway. So there will be an agreement. It will be soft and fuzzy, and the developing countries will also say, if you want, we're fine with measurable, reportable, verifiable, this MRV, that's a term you'll hear a lot, emissions reporting. You better have measurable, reportable, and verifiable commitments to write us a check. That $100 billion a year, that's just, it's like monopoly money for those who play that game at this point. Still, there's no sign, even with what the G7 said a couple of days ago, that that's going to somehow become a firm, as firm as kind of a bond. So I think, yes, there'll be an agreement. No, it won't be firm. Whether it's a success or not is almost irrelevant because of the scale of time of this issue. It's going to take us decades to move to a decarbonized global energy economy. That's what the G7 just said 2 days ago. They're committing to have a fossil-free economy in 2100.
Yeah.
That's what they said. And it could actually happen, but the treaty won't be the thing that makes that happen. That's my point of view.